So we start the show today with a jobs roundtable. As Vonnie just said, John Riding, RDQ Economics chief economist, is in studio. Patrick O'Keefe, director of economic research at J.H. Cohn and a former assistant secretary at the Labor Department, joins us from his office as well. We welcome you both.
Great to be here.
So, John, let's start with you. You get the home court, although since you're a soccer guy, I guess it's the home field advantage. Just what is your take on this report? You wrote today that when you see a report like this, it's a humbling experience in forecasting.
Oh, it certainly is. If you look at the expectations coming in, we were looking at 140,000 on payrolls. Looked like you had some upside risk given what we saw from ADP, ISM, and then you get a report which tells you that the level of payrolls in August was only 55,000 higher than the previously reported July level because we had those downward revisions. So really the number today was 55,000. The unemployment rate falls to 8.1%, but falls entirely for bad reasons. There's a whole bunch of people disappeared from the labor force. They didn't even become marginally attached. They just vanished. And the unemployment rate drops for bad reasons. Household employment down for 2 straight months. You can't look at this report and think that the economy, the labor market's looking in good shape at this point. I don't think we're talking recession, but we're talking GDP growth of the kind that we saw in the first half of this year being carried forward into the second half.
Patrick, pull out the data in this report that was most concerning to you. John mentioned some of the things that perhaps are concerning. Average hourly earnings, little changed in the month, temporary jobs down. So many small details. What did you take from it?
A couple of things. We tend, particularly now we're in the silly season, to look at the month-to-month data and be attracted to the monthly changes. Let's just step back and say, in the 6 months from September to February this year, we were averaging 200,000 jobs a month. In the 6 months since then, we've been averaging 97,000 net new jobs per month. Clearly, at that level, 97,000, we are not keeping up with growth in the labor force, much less making any headway on the elevated unemployment that we have. The CPS data, the household data, is what's most disconcerting. Across the board, all of the indicators suggest that the household sector is experiencing very dramatically a slowdown in the economy. Job holding has been down 2 consecutive months. As John just pointed out, the reason that any of the stress indicators dropped was because people are disappearing from the labor market. So it's overall a disappointing report on the job side and a troubling report on the household side.
So if you look at all this, I mean, what hypothesis do you have as to why people are continuing to drop out of the labor force? If you look at this labor force participation rate, it's the lowest in over 30 years. I think you've got to go back to September 1981 to see a lower reading on labor force participation.
John, I think we're up against 2 things. One is the secular problems that we have coming out of the meltdown beginning back in 2007. The other is secular in the labor force. If we look at the labor force participation rate or the employment rate, the proportion of work-age individuals with jobs, they peaked back in the late 1990s. And while they haven't been declining steadily since then, they have been on a downward bias over now a 12-year period. There are changes going on in our economy with respect to job creation that are structural. Whether or not we want to agree with the Fed chair as to whether or not the unemployment is structural, the way in which we create jobs and allocate labor has certainly changed over the last 12 years.
Do you agree, John?
Yeah, I think there is something structural going on in the labor force. There was a big discussion about this after Ed Lazier's paper at Jackson Hole last weekend. And I think quite a few people weren't convinced by his methodology of looking at industry and employment rates, say all this unemployment's cyclical. Orphanides, former Fed researcher and former governor of the Bank of Cyprus, pointed to the gap between job vacancies and unemployment, the so-called beverage curve, and saying we got 2.5 points more unemployment than we ought to have given the number of job openings. So I don't think it's purely cyclical. I think there's a lot to do with incentives. and a lot to do with labor mismatch, and inherently not a problem addressable by monetary policy.
Well, and certainly we have seen lots of shifts in the labor market, Patrick and John, where technology has taken over jobs. There's more contract employment. This has been shifting under our feet, hasn't it? So it's easy. I mean, maybe it is all cyclical, but we all know people whose jobs are gone and they're not coming back, right, Patrick?
Absolutely, and I think one of the problems with much of this discussion is that we're focusing on what's going on in the here and now, the very short run. There was a lot of investment in technology, beginning at the end of the 1990s, carrying forward into the early 2000s, and that has affected the types of work we have and the people who are doing it. If we look at the shortfall, the ullage in employment between where we are now and the end of 2007, we're missing 4.2 million private sector jobs. But when we look at just three industries, construction, manufacturing, and retail, we're missing 4.6 million jobs. So the blue-collar, the muscle jobs, by and large, are where the real gap lies. And I don't think anybody expects growth in those industries to be sufficient to get us back to pre-recession levels in the foreseeable future.
We want to play for you a soundbite that we got this morning from Bill Gross on Bloomberg Radio, and it's just about that debate that we were focusing in on just a moment ago, whether this is structural unemployment or cyclical, or even to a small extent structural unemployment. Well, this is what Bill Gross has to say.
We lean on the side of structural, and structural from the standpoint of job creation being almost permanently stunted and the unemployment rate almost permanently higher than what it was, simply because credit creation and leverage has changed substantially over the past few years. We have too much debt. The debt earns too little. The ability to employ that money at a productive rate is not what it was, and so we have a different economy.
John Whiting, RDQ Economics, you're in the studio with us. Explain how much of this is structural unemployment, if indeed you believe it is, which you do.
Well, I don't think we know, but if you look at what Bill was saying there, it's a very different interpretation of structural. It's like impaired credit creation structural. But I think it touches on which is kind of an odd definition, because the Fed might look at that and say, well, if we don't have enough credit generating demand, that's actually just a shortage of demand. But he touched on a very important part, and something again that came up last week at Jackson Hole. The Fed may be being counterproductive by trying to get long-term interest rates down. It's hurting pension funds because their future liabilities have to be discounted at a much lower rate, and so that raises their values. Pensioners trying to retire, you cannot buy an annuity and get any kind of return on it. And so you may actually be hurting the people who rely on fixed income more than you're helping the borrowers who might look for low long-term rates. Because it's very hard to argue you don't want to buy a house now because mortgage rates are too high. If you're not going to buy a house, it may be because you can't qualify for that mortgage. And therefore, even that is a non-monetary related issue in the credit markets. And I feel the Fed's actions with the second round of quantitative easing and what they're doing on the maturity extension program are potentially counterproductive.
So, Patrick, you spent many years working in Washington. You're director of economic research at J.H. Combe. You were an assistant secretary in the Labor Department. It seems to me that this also has potentially some impact on the fiscal debate. We're looking at this fiscal cliff. Well, if we have, number one, seniors who can't earn anything on whatever savings they have because rates are so low and it's a weak economy, so it's maybe kind of tough for them to find jobs. I would imagine this might make the entitlement debate just a little more heated because, if I can't live very well on what I've got, I'm not going to want to pay more for my Medicare or have anything taken out of my Social Security. I know current retirees are not facing that threat directly, but it seems like it does, at least emotionally and psychologically, make this an even tougher job.
It does. And let me just add something to what John said. The Fed, through low interest rates, is actually imposing a tax on households. If you look at the disposition of incomes, what you see is that investment incomes on an annualized basis are down about $300 billion a year. And that means that's less spendable money after tax dollars that can feed back into the economy. And when we then turn and we look at where we are with entitlement reforms and income transfer programs, it's remarkable the extent to which after-tax income increases, as we have gone through this recovery, are attributable to increases in transfers. In fact, transfer increases account for over half of the increase in disposable incomes during this recovery, and wage and salaries have only contributed 25% to the increase in those disposable incomes. So if we don't start looking at that and the extent to which the household sector is simply unable to sustain demand without those large transfers at a time when we recognize that we can no longer continue to finance them by deficits, we're going to miss the fork in the road where the fiscal cliff just leaves right off like we're Wile E. Coyote, and all of a sudden we're falling because we already went over the edge.
Well, you know, guys, but both of you, hasn't the Fed chairman and other Fed officials who support doing more quantitative easing, QE3, aren't they saying, oh, but come on, that's a small sacrifice. Sure, there's some savers who are being penalized. That seems to be dismissed out of hand completely by many top Fed officials.
Many, but not necessarily all. And certainly there was more recognition in the, I think, in the academic community that this is an issue. But you have a group at the Fed who come to their conclusions from using the Fed's model. And that model has the economy responding positively to lower long-term interest rates because it's driven by the borrowing side. And if I look at what's going on right now and the lack of jobs, it's not the cost of capital that's the issue. It's the after-tax return on capital. And the big issue for the fiscal cliff, I think all the points raised on the longer-term issue of entitlement is extremely important. But the first thing we hit on January 1 is a tax hike on GDP. It's equivalent to 3% of GDP if we don't deal with that. And I think that is weighing on the here and now. People saying, well, nothing happens in December, then tax rates are going up very significantly. And 3% GDP, the economy is growing 2%. It's not hard math to see that would add up to a recession in 2013.
So is it the fiscal cliff then, Patrick, that is paralysing people in terms of demand? Or is it that wages are just not increasing even for those who are at work?
To the day-to-day economic player, it's all of the above. What we hear from clients around the country is as follows. If they are confronted with a business decision, first option is to defer it because of uncertainty. Secondly, if they have to act on whatever the question is, they're then minimizing their commitment simply because of all of the unknowns, whether it's the Eurozone, the slowdown in emerging economies, the fiscal cliff, or just uncertainties in their own business. This situation in the political arena adds to it because it's hype bold day in and day out in the political debate.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, Patrick. Again, you spent many years in Washington. Well, you don't have to be in Washington to see that in a presidential election season, all numbers on the economy are super politicized. As much as the Obama administration probably wants to say, hey, look, the unemployment rate fell, you could just imagine the Republicans were clapping their hands and smiling, saying, oh, great, job growth slowed down. Do you, in your sense of not just the politics, but the actual correlations, how important is a weak jobs picture going to be as we head into November?
The mosaic that day-to-day players in the economy are confronted with is mushy data, it is uncertainty, and irrespective of how eventually they're going to vote in the political arena, they are in the day-to-day economic world voting by sitting on their hands, sitting on their wallets, and waiting for all of this to sort out. As a result, we are basically moving forward the fiscal cliff. At some point, we're even going to see it in the stock markets when people say, well, wait a second, I've got these capital gains that are potentially going to be taxed at higher rates next year, so why don't I take them right now and then see how this plays out? The political community seems to be oblivious to the reality that the rest of us are operating in.
Well, I think there's these fiscal issues, just the tax issues for next year is very important. To add to your point on the stock market, it's not just capital gains tax is going from 25% from 15% to 23.8%, but the dividend tax rate goes up from 15% to 43.4% because they revert back to ordinary income treatment. And then you have that 3.8% Medicare tax. If you've got a dividend paying stock and you've got nice capital gains in that, the tax system is crying out for you to sell it, realize those gains at a lower rate, and look for some other investment.
Very quick question while we're talking about the equity markets. I noticed Alan Ruskin this morning from Deutsche Bank had a little point where he said that since the early 20s or so, the equity market has had a lead time relative to the unemployment rate of about 8 months. So there's a 10% rise in the year-over-year equity prices. Then 8 months later, there's a reduction in unemployment by about 0.9%.
I think the problem with that is the stock market. What was the famous quote? Predicted 11 of the last 8 recessions. I mean, if you look at the stock market, the economy is doing great. Well, one part of the economy is the profits part of the economy has done great from the recession trough and has recovered in a V-shaped way. The labor market has not recovered in a V-shaped way. And so we have an unbalanced economy.
Well,
Patrick,
and to be fair,
final...
he did put in a caveat just to say that, for what these numbers are worth.
Quickly to Patrick O'Keefe, just a few seconds left with you, sir. Will the Fed announce quantitative easing 3 next week? Is it something on the table, but maybe not till later in the year?
I think their finger is very itchy. We'll probably get some extension of guidance. We'll get some talk. My guess is as to a specific program, I don't know. I read Bernanke's remarks. They were remarkably similar to what he gave us in 2010. I read that to say the chairman wants to do something.
Okay, Patrick O'Keefe, thank you so much for joining us, Director of Economic Research at J.H. Cohn.